Good afternoon. Yes, now it works better. So today's topic, securitization and global financial crisis. I hope you all enjoyed the movies. Was that going well? Nodding heads, enjoyable, too exhausting? Hopefully that was all okay and you recognize some of the stuff that we did in class. So the reason why I have pushed you to watch the movies is because what I will show you in today's slides otherwise looks a little bit dry. And I know that 2008, 2007, 2009, most of you were not very interested in finance. So that was before your time, but it was a very important time, very exciting time really too regarding banks and bank risk management. And also what we see today in today's economy and financial markets is basically an outcome of the global financial crisis. For example, that we have these super low interest rates in Australia and worldwide that has been caused by the global financial crisis or set off. Good. But before I get into that topic, I want to catch up on last week's lecture a little bit. We had a few slides that we skipped. Plus, it's a good warm-up for after the mid-semester break. So before the break, we talked about solvency risk, maybe a little bit of a warm-up. So if you talk about also solvency risk, we've got liquidity risk and solvency risk. If you talk about solvency risk, what balance sheet position is especially interesting? On the balance sheet, what should we look at if you're looking at solvency risk? ESF, loans, deposits, or what's the last one missing? Most important for solvency risk? Feel free to just yell it in. Bit louder? Equity. Equity or capital or net worth means all the same, but that's the important one to look at when we talk about solvency risk, right? So solvency risk is basically a relationship between risky assets on the one side and equity as a buffer on the other side, because equity is basically a buffer against losses before we go into insolvency. Good. If you're not quite clear on that one, you really have to catch up. So illiquidity, we need liquid funds on the asset side, reserves, and solvency, we need the buffer on the liability side, equity. These two are never to be mixed up. So we got all this stuff. Okay. The tricky thing with capital regulations here was that we are not taking in the simple ratio, but we are looking at so-called risk-weighted ratios. The idea here was, I'll just make a little bit repeat to warm up. The idea here was that we have potentially two different banks like these two. They've got the same size. So their total assets is identical. And if we just use total assets in order to say how much equity buffer they have to hold, we're missing out that they might have different risks on their balance sheet, different risks of the assets. So in this example here, we've got a bank B that has most or quite a lot of its funds invested in assets that are very, very safe, while bank A has much more risky assets here than bank B. So bank A has a much riskier asset structure, and therefore bank A should hold more buffer in case things go wrong. And that's the reason why we don't use just the total amount of assets to calculate our required equity, but we're using so-called risk-weighted assets. So risk-weighted asset means we give each of these assets a certain risk weight. The more risky the asset is, the higher the risk weight. So risk-free things like exchange settlement funds and government, Australian government bonds, basically zero risk weight. It's considered they're risk-free, so we don't have to worry about them. But other things get a higher risk weight, and we can calculate the risk-weighted assets. We did this last week, not last week, before the mid-semester break. Good. Then we have to fulfill these certain ratios. These are the Basel III ratios, so these are international bank capital regulations. But APRA in Australia has adopted them too. So APRA is sticking to the same percentages, and that means Australian banks do have to fulfill these minimum bank capital ratios. If you've got more bank capital, more bank equity, it's perfectly fine, but they're not allowed to have less than 7% of their risk-weighted assets in common equity, or 8.5% if we take all Tier 1 equity, and 10.5% if we take total capital. So remember, there's different kinds of capital, but we don't need that much detail for this class. We just need to distinguish between common equity, Tier 1, and total capital, and these numbers here. Good. We have done that last time we met for this bank here. So we calculate the risk-weighted assets for each class here, and then added them up and got this one as total amount of risk-weighted assets. And now we can calculate, well, depending on how much common equity Tier 1 this bank has, 20 billion in this example, that means it is 5.7% of this number. And since they were meant to have 7%, it's too little. So they have too little bank equity, and so on with the other ones. So if you've forgotten how that works, just get back into it, right? Important. Good. Then I said that during the global financial crisis, and you saw that in the movie too, right? Lots of banks got into trouble, insolvency trouble, right? So they made huge losses that are bigger than their equity. That means basically they're becoming insolvent or almost insolvent. And the regulators were in their neck and said, listen, you have to have more bank equity. And that's what the banks did since then. So we can see that here, these are quite surely the Australian banks. And we can see that they increased their equity, especially common equity Tier 1. So that's the proper equity. And then Tier 1 as well. System. So this is all related to what we saw in the movies. So a reminder, banks of course don't like bank regulation. If you look at this bank here, and I'm making a simple example, let's say there's regulations there that says 10% of risky assets should be covered by equity capital. So we have 100 in risky loans, and 10% of 100 is 10. So if a new customer comes to this bank now, let's say Bill Gates comes in and says, I want a loan. I want to borrow $50 from you, or $50 million. I'm willing to pay huge interest. I'm rich. There's no risk for you. What's the problem for the bank? Are they allowed to give additional loans out? They're not allowed to give it out because they don't have enough bank capital to cover it. Imagine if there's 150 here. It says 10% of risky assets, so there would be 15. They would need 15 bank capital if they want to give out an additional 15 loans, which they can't. So this bank is stuck now, then can't grow anymore, except if they get new bank capital, issue additional equity, do a rights issue, but that's usually very pricey and quite lengthy time to do. So it's not easy to get a new bank capital. And banks got into that situation in the past. So banks always like to grow, of course, make lots of profits. So they're scratching their heads, how can we do this? How can we change the system so it's better for us? And they came up with this idea, securitization. So we do like loans, but there's certain disadvantages with loans. Number one, they're illiquid, so we can't easily convert them into cash. They also come with interest rate risk because we've got duration mismatch on our balance sheet. So we've got long-term loans, short-term deposits that cause interest rate risk. We did that a few weeks back. Banks don't like the interest rate risk. Then also there's regulation that says we have to have a certain amount of bank capital. That was a problem that I just showed here. Banks also don't like that because that means they can't grow anymore, or they have to find expensive additional equity. And securitization is solving that problem. So what is the basic idea of securitization? You take lots of loans, bundle them together, and now write a security which says if you buy this piece of paper, you get all the cash flows that we get out of these loans. So basically you're buying the loans off us. So the banks are selling all the loans. What's the beauty of that one? Number one, if you sell something, you get immediate cash in. So that's good. Banks are happy to get additional cash in, and they can give out more loans. Number two, they can still specialize on providing new loans. Then the default risk, if they sell the loan, they also sell the risk that something might go wrong with that loan to the new owner. Let's imagine if I gave a loan to a friend of mine, $1,000. So I've got a piece of paper that says I will get $1,000 next year for my friend, and I sell you that piece of paper for $900. Then I immediately get $900, so I'm happy about that one. And on top of that, if my friend decides to go to the Cayman Islands and disappear forever, It's your problem. I already got my $900. You're not getting any money back from that piece of paper. So that's what's meant here, default risk, mainly with the buyer. And here, this is the main beauty. The loan is getting off balance. So it's not on the balance sheet of the bank anymore. And if you don't have the loan on your balance sheet, you don't have it as risk-weighted assets, and you don't have to hold that much bank capital. You solved all that problem. Now, this is just an overview. I give you a few overviews, and then we go into more detail. I just don't want to lose you in between. So the basic idea here is we take lots of different loans, plonk them all together in a pot, in a portfolio, and then we sell securities or pieces of paper that say whatever money is coming into this portfolio pot is going then to the new owner. And by selling these securities, we get cash onto our balance sheet. Doing it more step by step. So what do we have here? We've got the bank from beforehand that has 100 in loans. These are 10-year loans at 8%. So that each year they're paying 8%, and after 10 years they're repaid. And this bank now had the problem, if you have to hold 10% in equity, they can't grow anymore. They're not allowed to give out any additional loans. And now they're securitizing these loans. What does that mean? First step is we want to figure out how much money can we actually get for selling these loans. And we can use the financial mathematics that we had beforehand in class for that one. So if you have Excel running, try it. What do we have here? We've got here year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And year 10 I've got twice in here. So put in all the cash flows that you get out of this loan contract. And we discount it at 5%. So the thing here will do it automatically, and we get the present value of all these cash flows calculated here. And think of it. If you get 8% each year of $100, and currently in the market the interest rate is 5%, this cash flow stream, is that going to be very attractive or unattractive? Are you willing to pay for it more than $100 or less than $100? That's something that everybody should be able to answer, even without a computer and without any formulas. Just think of it like a bond. Very careful, you have to type in the numbers here in this field, I just realized, because these are already the present values. So if you put in numbers, it needs to go in this column. More, it must clearly be more than 100, because 8% is way more attractive than 5%. Right? So if that's a bond, it would be sold over face value. And the exact number, anybody figured that out? So it's 123.17 for me. So feel free to write that down. 123.17 is the present value of all these cash flows. So it means that net present value of this $100 loan with the 8% loan rate is actually 123 currently. And what do we have here? Here we say we sell the security at $120. Why don't we sell it at 123.18? Or flip it around, why don't people pay 123.18 for it? What might go wrong? If you buy lots of loans, if you buy $10 million of loans off this bank, even though the present value is $123, is it for sure that you get all these cash flows in? What might go wrong? So there's always a chance that some of these loans go into default. Maybe some of the customers don't pay. And because you bought the right to get all the cash flows, well, it might be 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, 7. And instead of 100, you get back only 97. And then, of course, you would not end up with the present value of 123. So we always discount a little bit for risk. So in my example here, I just made it, subtracted $3 something, and we sell these loans altogether for $120. Now, the beauty of that one is twofold here. Number one, we immediately get cash in. Actually, threefold, I might say. Number two, the loans are gone. We sold these loans to somebody else now. We don't need to worry about them. And now because we don't have any loans on our book anymore, we don't have any worries with bank capital regulation because we have zero risk-weighted assets now. We only have cash on our balance sheet. So that means if Bill Gates comes now, we can easily give him a new loan. Also, what we can see is all of a sudden bank capital increased by 20. Now, where is that magic coming from? Yesterday, the loans were in our books at $100. Now we sold them for 120. It's a bit weird, right? The reason for that one is usually for the next 10 years, these loans each year would have given us a little bit of a profit. 8% each year minus the cost that we have for deposits each year, but each year we would have made a little bit of a profit. Now that we sell the loans on the spot, we basically put forward the present value of all future profits to right now. So we don't have to wait for profits to come over 10 years. We get the profits immediately as present value terms. And that's the reason why bank capital goes up, because we pull forward the profit from the future to the present time. And we immediately have more bank capital. And you can see now how beautiful that is for that bank. Yesterday, this bank was not allowed to make any new loans because it had a lot of risk-weighted assets and too little bank equity, bank capital. They sell off all their loans, they pull forward their profits. Now all of a sudden, number one, they have much fewer risk-weighted assets here. Number two, they've got much more bank capital. So now they can grow much more. My example here is, again, Bill Gates comes through the door, asks if we can get a loan, and we just give him a new loan. In my example here, $110 new loans. And remember, when banks give new loans, they don't really give out the old cash here. What they're doing is they're creating new deposits. So we immediately put this loan, we just make a double booking. So we say, okay, Bill Gates owes us $110, but at the same time, on his deposit account, we put $110. So we just lengthen our balance sheet. And the bank grows. And you can see this bank, all of a sudden, twice as big as the bank beforehand. Same bank, via securitization. Doesn't violate any regulations. And why stop here? If this bank wants to grow even further. Number one, I think we said bank capital regulations was meant to be 10% in my example. How many risk-weighted assets can this bank afford with 30 bank capital? If this is meant to be 10% of all risk-weighted assets can go up to 300. So they can give much, much more loans out. Remember, yesterday they were limited to 100. Now we are already at 300. But why stop here? What we easily could do is we could sell these loans again as securitization. And remember in the movie how they said it was a crazy, profitable, and a very big business, securitization. So that happened, what happened in the real world too. The banks securitized a lot of their loans. And that's what we see here. So it used to be 18% of all loans got securitized. By 2006, 40%, and then even more, up to 2008. So what can we see here? Global securitization deals in trillions of dollars, up and up and up and up and up. Huge business up to 2008, then of course it didn't work that well anymore.